Hello and welcome to this Edge 2020 deep dive session, Kubernetes in the Enterprise. My name is James Henderson, Editorial Director of Asia Pacific at IDG, and your host for today's session, as we assess enterprise adoption in relation to Kubernetes, outline some key customer challenges and outsourcing requirements, and also examples of best practice and opportunities ahead. Joining me today are a panel of experts in Australia. We've got Harshu Deshpande, Country Lead of Australia at Slalom Build, Emma Pudney, CTO of Asia Pacific and Japan at Rackspace Technologies, and Gaurav Thadani, Software Engineer at DiUS. Welcome, Harshu, Emma, and Gaurav. Emma, I'll start with you. I mean, really the point of this session was to dissect some of the media hype and industry headlines, because we're in the media, we write about Kubernetes, it comes up a lot in our analyst reports, but we really wanted to get a handle on perception versus reality. Is this Kubernetes in the enterprise, is this a media thing at the minute, or are customers actually talking about this?
Customers are definitely talking about it. And I think, you know, to a degree we're starting to enter the mainstream of the Kubernetes era. So if you consider containers are considered mainstream. If you look at AWS, they talk about compute being serverless, containers, and VMs. And when you consider the enterprise, it's really, am I going to go down a containerization or virtualization track? And virtualization didn't really become mainstream until you had an orchestration platform like VMware to drive that adoption. And Kubernetes really represents that for containers, arguably better because it's an open source option. Having said that, you know, Kubernetes still does represent, there's a real barrier to entry with regards to the implementation of Kubernetes. You need a team to run Kubernetes. It's not something you're going to set up overnight. And, you know, when I talk to people about their experience with Kubernetes, they say Kubernetes is great, but I've had challenges with, you know, getting the networking to work, but you know, getting the auto scale functioning in the right way was a real challenge. So I think that things like the cloud platform versions of Kubernetes have driven some of that adoption, because, you know, they allow you to, you know, they manage the intricacies under the hood and abstract some of the complexity. And so the platforms from AWS, Azure, and Google really help drive that adoption of Kubernetes to become more sort of mainstream.
Thanks for the opener, Emma. And the point around barrier to entry, I think we'll get to as well, because you're right. There's one thing for us to say this on a video call around the adoption, but then actually to get moving on these things can be quite difficult. But Harshu, I'll just bring you in on these opening statements around that idea of mainstream, if that's how you want to phrase it. I mean, do you agree with Emma so far, or how are you seeing that taking shape in Australia?
Yeah, 100% agree with Emma. I think especially in the last 2 years, that explosion's been almost exponential. And I think it's exactly as Emma was saying, where you see kind of containers and Kubernetes now is in that continuum between VMs and lifting and shifting workloads to the serverless, and really containers and Kubernetes kind of fits in the middle of that. And so as we're seeing more and more enterprises do some of their monolithic applications being broken up into microservices and, you know, becoming kind of digital natives, we're starting to see containers and serverless applications really start to explode a lot more. We're seeing kind of if I was to put a wet finger guess, we're seeing about a 50-50 split between the number of customers that are doing containers and container orchestration versus serverless. So there is a significant amount of growth, and that growth is only going to continue and explode further as more and more customers start to move their on-prem applications onto the cloud. We're really getting to that meat of it now, where a lot of the customers are starting to move their more complex workloads. They're starting to move data pipelines into the cloud, and they're starting to use data lakes in the cloud. And that's driving an enormous amount of explosion in the adoption of Kubernetes. I think to Emma's point, I think, you know, the complexity to date has always been managing your own Kubernetes, roll your own version. And I think as the platform's trying to mature, as some of the cloud providers are providing their own platforms and capability, that barrier to entry is becoming easier. So it's not just a small digital team on the side that's doing its own Kubernetes installation and management, but it's actually the enterprise that's adopting it. And I'm seeing that quite a bit.
I'm just going to say one thing I've heard that sort of aligns with what Harshu said there is I've heard someone refer to Kubernetes as the Goldilocks solution. when you're considering around your innovation curve, do you want to go down the serverless, or sometimes that can be a little bit confronting to organizations, and lift and shift, but where's the innovation in that? And Kubernetes can sometimes, or containers and Kubernetes can sometimes be positioned as that Goldilocks solution in the middle.
Yeah, 100%. Because I think one of those things is how much control do you want to give away? And sometimes containers still feels like it's a little bit like VMs and a little bit like serverless, but you still have some semblance of control over it. I think people, especially when you've got sensitive workloads, it's a known batch workload, it's highly parallelized. Containers are kind of that sweet spot in the middle that gives you the balance of both.
Gaurav, just to bring you in, maybe you haven't heard of the Goldilocks scenario, but really well put there, Emma.
Yeah.
What's your take on the mainstream element? If we're there yet?
I think from an enterprise standpoint, I think in the last couple of years, I've worked, as a consultant, I've worked on various engagements. And in fact, the last 3 have all had a Kubernetes flavor to it, right? There was a European automotive, there was recently an Australian Melbourne-based fintech, and I've even worked with a New York-based retailer, and all of them have been Kubernetes. They've all been, they take up the platform with different drivers or agenda, but I think these are enterprises, and it's certainly been, it's becoming mainstream. I completely agree and, echo Emma's and Harshu's thoughts around the barrier to entry. But I think it's that, when you cross that barrier, or you really have that, critical mass of teams or services that you need to deploy, that's when you find the sweet spot using Kubernetes. But I think it's out there, it's mainstream. Everyone's, either getting into it, starting to use it, or, leverage the benefits that a container-based orchestration platform has to offer.
Just and good to get a handle on the opening sentiment in terms of where the market is, because, and I'd like your feedback on this, given that you're at the front working with customers, the way the market usually works, or when we deal with some of the vendors, AWS, Microsoft, Google, for example, any other vendors, they would build a product, they would create the market hype, the reputation, and then they would move the customers along eventually, and the customers would come later. I mean, is that the same with Kubernetes, Emma? And what I mean by that is, are customers picking up the phone talking to Rackspace Technologies about Kubernetes, or Rackspace Technologies initiating that conversation, if you know what I mean? Are the customer, is this top of their mind, or is it something that is really being introduced by your consultants, the experts, the providers?
So the first thing I would say is that, unlike many other platforms which have been driven by commercial vendors, one of the unique aspects of Kubernetes is the fact that it's an open source project. So it's really one of the first scenarios where you're seeing a really community-led driven approach to the adoption of certain technology. So I think that's one differentiator, or one thing that differentiates Kubernetes from other potential options. The other, in terms of, like who's contacting who, we absolutely have customers who are reaching out and talking to us about implementing Kubernetes, or how do they go about it, or they've started and maybe they're finding it a wee bit challenging and they want some assistance in, the implementation and so forth. We're seeing, initially we saw a lot of pilot style projects for Kubernetes, but now what we're certainly seeing, if we sort of look at the pilot type question and versus production, I'd be hard pressed to say that, I can't think of examples of customers who have gone down the pilot path and not gone to production. So they're coming to us, talking to us about Kubernetes. We have a managed Kubernetes platform, but a lot of our work is in the professional services side of things to start off with, versus, the managed services piece. So, if we talk about pilots, for example, in organizations, we have financial institutions that are using it in production. We have pharmaceutical organizations who are using it in production. We have airlines who are using it in production. And we're not talking about, minor implementations here. We're talking about, one example being an American airline that runs their flight management platform on Kubernetes. And we obviously help them with the design approach, implementation of that. But this is an area that's highly regulated by the US government. And so they stipulate that if the platform is to go down for 15 minutes or more, all aircraft need to be grounded. That's not just production environments, that's like business critical type stuff. And we've also got examples closer to home with, large financial institutions are using it to lift workloads out of IT and closer to the developer and closer to the customer, so that the developers can really focus on applications. Now, as enterprises, they've got a plethora of other applications too, you know, physical, VMware, public cloud, but, you know, Kubernetes is an equal player in that game. You know, it's a real part of it. So yeah, customers are definitely coming to us and speaking about it. That's not to say we won't try and speak to customers when we think it's the right fit. But the real question, and this is, you know, probably say this throughout the entire piece, and it aligns with what Harsh was saying before as well. You know, it's all about, if there's one message that I can communicate, it's all about selecting the right platform for your application. It's not about going, okay, Kubernetes, I do Kubernetes, so all my servers and, all my applications are going to be containerized. You focus on your business problems, you focus on the customer outcomes, and you work back from there and then select which technology stack. So, you know, our conversations with customers are more around what's the right, what problems are you trying to solve? And then let's work out what application or technology stack we're gonna deploy on.
I think we're not seeing customers are calling us and they're not saying, should I use Kubernetes? They're saying, how should I implement Kubernetes? Or how should I use it? I think it's always that conundrum between, you know, standardization versus autonomy. And a lot of teams did try to do lots of autonomy, and, you know, you can roll your own Kubernetes, and there were, you know, multiple distributions of Kubernetes being deployed across an enterprise. And now we're seeing a bit more of a consolidation and a bit more thought and structure being put into how do you really allow it to be adopted and scale at an enterprise level, so that the development teams can kind of go off and do feature delivery. They're not having to manage a Kubernetes cluster as part of their development. And I think that's the question that we're seeing much more of, rather than the question of should I use Kubernetes? I don't think I've had that question in the last 2 years, to be frank.
Yeah, Gaurav, just to bring you in on this around the, you know, the actual conversation and the trigger points. I mean, the fair point there that the answer doesn't always have to be Kubernetes. It could be, it depends what the question is, I suppose. But how is the customer conversations taking shape at your end? I mean, are they pilot projects? Are they dipping their toe and then eventually, to Emma's point, taking it on and moving further forward?
Yeah, I think I completely agree to what we've just spoken about. So it's always been about the business problems. In our case, we've had maybe two. I would like to highlight one interesting business problem, but I'll come back to that. I think one of the customers was already using Kubernetes. So that was, you know, something that we went on to deliver business outcomes with. But this particular customer was dealing with, it's dealing with retail data, and that was very sensitive because they had like sales and financial information of multiple tenants. So it was a multi-tenanted pricing platform. And why they wanted to use or leverage Kubernetes is purely to separate out workloads while leveraging the existing infrastructure. So they had initially compute built for every tenant, and that worked out expensive from, say, you know, paying from cloud billing. So the driver to actually use Kubernetes was to run the same workloads, but in a more, I would say, you know, by leveraging your infrastructure to a much greater potential, while keeping the security or dealing with sensitive data as it's supposed to be dealt with. So I think, yeah, I think the key to all customers in consulting is to deal with business problems, and then, you know, drive it from there to see whether Kubernetes is the right fit. I would think, yeah, you know, you could solve your business problem by even using serverless. You could even do it with Kubernetes, but the initial, the investment that you need to put in to build up a Kubernetes stack, it needs to ultimately, you know, give you that return of investment, which is like, yeah, you know, I have maybe 5 teams rather than 1 team using it, you know, stuff like that.
Yeah. And Harsha, just to bring you back in on this. So, you know, we come up a few times, that barrier to entry, or how to get started and get moving. I mean, what are some of the issues that would prevent Kubernetes from being rolled out or deployed, or however we phrase it? Because I suppose, I think Emma mentioned it, it's not as simple as obviously as jumping on a Zoom call and then, you know, a customer, the penny dropping, and then tomorrow they're away they go. So are there common challenges? Is it the cost? Is it the skills? Is it the access to talent? Who knows? All of the above?
Skills and talent is like the number one issue that's concerning everyone, because, you know, managing your Kubernetes cluster and your deployment is extremely complex. So if you take the workflow from a developer packaging up a container through to it, you know, meeting all of the security and compliance requirements and reliability requirements, patching your Kubernetes clusters and upgrading and updating them, on a regular basis, there's a lot of work. And for individual development teams to maintain and manage that on a regular basis is extremely difficult and requires a level of skill set that's extremely hard to get at size and scale. And I think that's always been the constraint to date. I think having some of these managed Kubernetes instances now come out from the cloud providers and even Rackspace really helps remove that barrier to entry, because then you can have a smaller footprint of team that's maintaining, I would almost call it platform ops level, where they're providing a capability to allow the development teams to actually just build the containers, but then having a standardized process to actually deploy those containers into clusters all the way from dev to production. And I think that's changing the way that the technology is being adopted.
Gaurav, go on, Emma. I think I'd seen you.
I was just going to add to Harsh's point there around, what developers should be focusing on. I'll say it again, absolutely the application and not the infrastructure. But, almost investing in Kubernetes talent can be a bit of a mistake, because, we have these managed platforms that can manage those elements for us. And if you think of an organization where your value is your application, you want your attention and your focus on that application. We have one Kubernetes customer that has 900 developers, and 870 of those, if they logged into Kubernetes, couldn't tell you what it does or how it operates. And that's the way it should be, because then they're focusing all of their energy on the business differentiator, which is the application.
Yeah, and I use that word differentiation, which is exactly what I use. And I think AWS calls it undifferentiated heavy lifting. And so effectively it means, if you don't have anything that's going to add value and there's a system of differentiation for you, pass it off, right? Someone else can do that work, so you can focus on what's really adding value for your customers or for your developers.
Gaurav, just on that, on the skills side, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, I'd like to come back on the skills. You brought up an interesting point about challenges, and I thought I'll just bring up one challenge that I've seen. And it's pretty much like when you're using, say, a Kubernetes or the ecosystem around it, there are a lot of moving parts, right? There are small components that you bring in, tools to work with the cluster, and the most of it, I think literally everything is open source in that ecosystem. So you got to keep up with it. It's quite fragmented. The ecosystem is extremely vibrant. You're going to get help from the community. There are a lot of tools to get your job done, but you have to keep up with it. And what happens with this, right, is inevitably some component somewhere is always going to be beta, and they're tagged as beta. Like even if you have to deploy a container, you'd see one tag in one of those YAML files saying beta. And that's something that you have to convince your customer. Like if your customer is a bank, you have to convince them that, this is production ready, but it still says beta, stuff like that. So that's one of the key challenges that I've seen. I think in terms of skills, right, like having, keeping up to date with what's in the community is again key, because it's evolving so fast. Like if you were to patch your Kubernetes cluster maybe every week, you'd actually get significant updates. So that's one challenge and one skill that you need to keep up with.
Just on that, the skills, because there's a reason why I asked you three out of most in terms of your expertise, but also the companies, because the skills part lends itself to the outsourcing element as well, in terms of how customers lean on providers and specialists such as a Rackspace or a DiUS or a Slalom, in terms of what they are asking for you. Is this a different type of outsourcing requirement at Kubernetes? Is it different to any other engagements you have from customers in terms of what they ask of you? Emma, are those conversations different? So if this was a standard, cloud deployment or anything else within your portfolio, would it require different areas of skills from Rackspace as well to participate? Or how do you guys approach these from an outsourcing perspective?
Absolutely. So from a skills perspective, and how do we approach it? So relating back to the previous question in skills, in terms of, do we have skills that are specific, like the industry, not Rackspace, specific to Kubernetes and technology, Kubernetes in particular, and building applications specifically to leverage the underlying strengths of Kubernetes? That's a really unique, and I would say a skill set that's in need within the market. So I'm not a developer myself, but I've spoken to a number of developers who leverage the platform, and they say things like, it's really hard to get your head around how to developed specifically for the benefits, the robustness and the scalability that is inherent in Kubernetes. So that's a really unique skill set, and it's a slightly different development paradigm than, say, traditional application development. But we do have, containers is a very common skill or an ample skill within the market. There's a lot of containers, and Kubernetes is trainable. So if you think of Rackspace, and we obviously have both professional services and the managed services side of things. We've taken, like, over the past year, we've raised 35 Rackers to the level of expert in Kubernetes, who prior to that, a year prior, had no Kubernetes skills whatsoever. So there's also different skill sets. There's developing applications for Kubernetes, which is something that sort of sits more in our professional services, app modernization style part of our business. And then there's, making sure that we're running the infrastructure and keeping things up and running. So I think, we need specific Kubernetes skills in that space. But like when you're looking at a service provider, the things that you should really be considering, number one is the Kubernetes version that they're running their version of the platform, or is it pure Kubernetes? Because it's very easy in the market to end up selecting a platform that's 20% Kubernetes and 80% some other, the vendor's value add on that platform. And a lot of organizations choose Kubernetes because they want portability and they don't want lock-in. And that is basically another form of unintentional lock-in associated with that. Then, so checking on the purity of the implementation, then, and this relates back to your previous question, making sure that that the service provider can offer expertise and skills in the areas that you need it, and advice, because that's more where the value comes from, rather than running these underlying platforms. As you said, you can go to the cloud and you can get yourself the infrastructure and the Kubernetes platform run for you. It's really the advice that can be offered on top of that delivers the key value. And then the final thing is, just making sure it's as pure as possible and that it's upstream compatible. And you look at things like the AWS, for example, their platform, although not CNCF certified, it is, the only real differences are a few adapters to be able to integrate with other AWS services. And I think, and you guys might know a little bit better, being more technical probably, but I believe as well that the reason that it isn't certified is because there's some part of multi-tenancy that doesn't necessarily work with some of the certification requirements. So, I think even the head of EKS at Amazon is actually on the governing board for CNCF. So, these provide an alternative approach if you're not going to go down the managed services path. The key thing on the managed services path is to make sure that the implementation is pure as possible. Even Rackspace in the past has fallen into the trap of just adding more capabilities and functionality, and that's valuable to the customer, but also works it has a little bit of a negative impact because customers want to make sure that they don't get locked into a platform. Our future strategy is very much, and our future roadmap and current development is all around purifying a version of Kubernetes.
I think, and to take that on, Harshu, and I think, Emma, you phrased the question much better than me in terms of what a service provider should look like, how you should select them. So I'm going to steal your question and put it back to Harshu. Harshu, Slalom, obviously, in terms of your expertise and the customers you're working with, where does your value sit when you're engaging in Kubernetes deployments or conversations? What are you looking to add from an outsourcer perspective?
Yeah, so I think one of the things is the differences between us and some of the managed service providers is we normally work alongside the client and the managed service provider, because a lot of our work is actually around digital transformation and cloud transformation. So as part of the overall setup of setting up everything from cloud adoption office, helping with cloud migration, we actually work with their existing managed service provider ecosystem to actually build the necessary capability that supports the application and all of the stack underneath it going forward. And as part of that, one of the things that we've been looking at doing, and this is one of the things that we've been doing for a pretty large global fast food chain, is they've done the kind of cloud migration, they've got the Kubernetes cluster. What they're really looking at doing now is standardizing that capability so that it can scale. And what we're looking at doing is really building kind of a common platform ops capability that sits underneath. It's effectively like cloud foundation enablers that allows multiple teams to consume that almost through a service catalog type of service, where it's a common front door where they consume these types of workflows in Kubernetes they only have to worry about the container packaging. And as part of that, what we do is we actually help them upskill some of their capabilities. So we've got a group in my team under Slalom Build, which is called Cloud DevSecOps, and our entire job is to help stand up platform ops capabilities that's common across a whole bunch of organizations. And standing up containers and Kubernetes is kind of one part of that stack. Could be things like an iPaaS capability for integration and a bunch of other things that also sit underneath that.
Great. Gaurav, how about at DiUS? How is your consultation? How is your approach taking shape in the Kubernetes form?
Yeah, I think it's, again, the best and the quickest way to get a business outcome or a business goal achieved. It could either be a managed service or something more that the customer needs from a compliance or regulatory perspective. Like we've had customers who may or may not want to be on AWS because they are probably in working in retail, and for some reason they don't want to be in that, or they want to be in GCP because of some other reason. So yeah, so we've seen that like there is an affinity towards some providers. It could be because they're in a particular region or because of their business problem. So we've seen that as one thing to pick up a particular, to choose a particular vendor over the other. We've also seen one of the banks where they're trying to leverage Kubernetes and transforming their on-prem applications into containers, so that they could migrate to the cloud over time. So that's another flavor of having to choose Kubernetes. But in terms of, I would say, in terms of outsourcing, one thing that probably works better is having a dedicated team or working with specialists or more skilled people in Kubernetes with the customer or co-located, because your innovation is effectively the product and not a Kubernetes cluster. You want to innovate your product. And Kubernetes is part of it. It's not like it can be manufactured out elsewhere and then be used. So yeah, co-located, product-led. I think that's the best way to go about it.
Great. Well, we've got a few minutes to go before we wrap up on this. I really appreciate the insights, and I'm learning myself. It's a very new area for most of the market, but you three are clearly very well versed in it, which is great. But just to wrap up, as we move into 2021, just some key areas of focus for customers ahead. I mean, it's quite a hard question because it's very generic in that you could attack this in any form. But if you're a customer and you were on the path to engaging with Kubernetes, or you were assessing it, maybe what would your advice be going forward? So Harshu, I'll throw to you first.
Cool. Yeah, I think the biggest advice I give to customers is just be careful, because sometimes autonomy can be crippling. And so really what tends to happen is most people start with the conversation around, can I start to manage my own Kubernetes installation? And I normally start with the other way. I would say, well, wherever possible, you should start with the managed services first, EKS or AKS or whatever it is, and then work backwards. Because really, if you could start with that, you're effectively starting with, a managed instance, and all you're doing is you're doing more work if you were to manage your own instance later on. So you're only adding work later on. But really, the concept would be to start with the kind of managed instance first, and then work backwards from there, because you can always adapt as you go along. And I think the rate of pace of change of those managed services is coming up so fast that I think the amount of R&D investment they're spending into making those platforms much better, and solving things like IO latency issues, which is one of the big things that we haven't covered, that's causing some friction. We're starting to find that that's being improved significantly over time, right, by those providers. And I think the ability for you to tap into that innovation and that speed of change that they're providing is not something that you'll be able to easily manage within your own enterprise. You're effectively a customer of one, right, versus a customer of many. Great,
thanks, Harshu. Gaurav, what about you? What's your words of wisdom or advice, guidance, however you want to phrase it?
I think it's not a Goldilocks solution. It's no silver bullet to having all your problems solved. It's a journey that you need to take on, work with maybe specialists or consultants in that space to get either achieve some outcome, maybe rapid development or rapid deployment, or getting your applications to market out quickly. The reason I say that is because it's just not workloads that we deploy into production. There are external things which may be, which have to be with the vendor. It could be your DNS entries. It could be a database, a managed version of a database. It could be, data buckets like Google Cloud Storage or S3. So those things, and if your applications integrate with them, they still need to be, catered to when you are porting from one vendor to another. So when Kubernetes tries to solve portability, it's not a silver bullet to portability. You still have to solve for everything else. So yeah, I think that's my key advice that I would give to anyone, that Kubernetes is great. The outcomes that you want to measure are your workloads can be deployed or are portable. But yeah, watch out for the pitfalls.
Sound advice. Emma, final word?
I'm going to say two things, and you can edit out the first one if it's too long to do anymore. So the first thing, I just wanted to respond to something Gaurav said there around, using Kubernetes in a portability sort of use case. And it's a real trap to fall into. And I think I've actually heard Gartner analysts refer to it as like the portability tax. So you've got to be, like, if you choose to use something like Kubernetes because you're trying to achieve portability, first of all, you're now limiting yourself in the amount of cloud native technology that you can use that comes specific to events. So you're basically saying, okay, I'm going to carve off a whole heap of innovation that I'm not going to use because I want to remain portable. Secondly, you are still going to be dependent on things like ephemeral storage and networking elements and DNS, like Gaurav said. So you've still got an element of stickiness there anyway. So, the advice that I would give in that particular space is appreciate that regardless of which approach you're going to take, there's going to be an element of lock-in. Mitigate it to a reasonable extent. Don't go crazy. And then accept that you've got an element of lock-in. And then save all that cash you were trying to do to be able to create an application that's totally portable on the off chance that one day you do have a reason that you're not going to stick with that vendor.
I always go back to skills portability. What it's giving you is not application portability, but skills portability, because effectively, whether you're on AWS or Azure, you're now using the same Kubernetes instance across both and the same tech stack. So you can have people go across, but that's all it's giving you. It's not giving you application portability.
Absolutely. And so then that was the bit that was not answering the first question. That was responding to Gaurav. So now talking about what is 2021 all about and so forth, I'm going to take a step back and really take that business view again. I see that Kubernetes is an enabler. It's a tool in the cloud native toolkit. It is, a form of cloud native development, which is really more of a philosophy than it is a technology. So it's more around saying, let's focus on the application. By implementing things like, technologies like Kubernetes, it is driving things like DevOps culture. It's driving automation. It's driving a focus on the application. And again, back to, that allows the business to focus on the business outcome, the customer's outcome, and not worry about, and work back from there, and not design applications based on infrastructure. It also enables things and leads to things like emerging technology. So it leads to data lakes and big data. It leads to ML, AI. It gets organizations comfortable with the concepts like serverless. It gets them comfortable with concepts like immutable infrastructure and ephemeral storage. It leads the customers and organizations down the path so that they can open the door to the way that they do application development, and removes the constraint of worrying about infrastructure. So it's more of a philosophy and an enabler, I think, than it is necessarily, a pure technology advantage.
Right. Well, on that note, I will say, Emma, thank you. Gaurav, thank you. Harshu, thank you. Really engaging, robust, and open debate. I think we could probably keep going, to be honest, but really appreciate, seriously, that you all taking the time to share your insights on what's happening. It's still a relatively new concept for some in the market, so it's good to get a handle on how the CIOs and customers are actually approaching this. So thank you all, and thank you all for watching. Thanks very much.